Hey kids, it's time for another Bible story. Let's get right to it. Life Outside the Garden, Part 3. Do you remember why God's people had to leave God's place? God drove Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden because they disobeyed him and rejected him as king. And everything God had warned them about disobeying his word came true. Adam and Eve were now separated from God and began having difficulty with each other. Raising children was hard, finding food was even harder, and their coming death was now beginning to make their bodies grow older. Life outside the garden was terrible. Now Adam and Eve ruled the world in evil ways, and they had children who did just the same. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all turned away from God. Outside the garden, everyone doubted how good God was. Outside the garden, everyone disobeyed God's word. Outside the garden, everyone ruled the world in evil ways. This made God very sad. All the peoples of the earth had rejected him as king. So, God decided to judge all the peoples of the earth. He decided to send a big flood on the place he had made. But there was one man, named Noah, who listened to God. God told Noah to build a great big boat. God told Noah to put many animals on the boat. God told Noah to bring his family on the boat. And Noah did what God said. Then, God judged the world. God sent a big flood of water. Everything that lived on land died. But Noah, his family, and the animals on the boat were saved. Do you know what the flood teaches us? God will judge every single person who rejects him as king. And do you know what God's judgment teaches us? Every single person needs God's blessing. And guess what? God promised to do just that. God promised to bless all the peoples of the earth. God's Big Promise, Part 4. Many years after the flood, God made a big promise. He said to a man named Abraham, "Go to the land I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed." Wow, that was good news. God told Abraham to go to a new place because God was going to make a new people so that God's blessing would spread to all people. What a big promise God made to Abraham. Abraham listened to God's word, and then Abraham did what God said. Abraham went to the land God showed him. Do you know how Abraham felt when he got there? Abraham felt afraid. He wasn't sure how God would keep his promise. After all, Abraham and his wife Sarah were very old, too old to have children. One night, Abraham thought and thought, how could he become a great people if he didn't have even one child? And how could he become a blessing to all peoples without children and grandchildren of his own? God knew what Abraham was thinking. God talked to him. "Don't be afraid, Abraham. Come outside and look up into the night sky. Count all the stars, if you can. You will have as many children as there are stars in the sky." So Abraham went outside. Abraham looked up into the night sky and tried to count the stars. And then something happened. As he stood there counting, suddenly, Abraham believed God's word. That made God very happy. His promise was very big, and Abraham's faith in God's promise was very big too.